My name is Kathy, and I work for the Adirondack Land Trust. Our conservation work protects wildlife habitat and connectivity, providing space for wildlife to move freely in search of food and mates and habitat. We are always eager to learn more about wild animals, which is why the Adirondack Land Trust is delighted tonight to welcome you to our presentation, Rewilding the Northeast, Bringing Catamounts Home. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Renee Seacor. Renee is the Rewilding Director for Mighty Earth, an environmental advocacy organization, where she oversees the Bring Catamounts Home campaign to restore catamounts to the forests of the northeastern United States. Renee is also a charter member of the Adirondack Land Trust's Next Generation Council, a volunteer advisory board of professionals in their 20s and 30s who love the Adirondacks and provide us with great advice, host events, and do just so much more. Renee, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kathy. It's been an honor to get to serve as a Next Generation Council member and to get to work with and really get to know some of the ALT staff a little bit better and see them work firsthand on their mission of protecting the Adirondacks, which I hope potentially has a catamount in its future. So I'll give a quick overview of kind of the presentation that I'll walk through tonight, and then we'll dive into it. So as Kathy said, Renee Seacor, I'm the Northeast Rewilding Director with an organization called Mighty Earth. Tonight, our talk is going to talk about one of Mighty Earth's new projects, which is our Bring Catamounts Home campaign, to working to restore catamounts to the northeastern forests. You can learn more about this initiative at bringcatamountshome.org, and I'll share some more details on that later. But for tonight, I plan to kind of dive into this conservation topic, explore a bit more about the recent science that's looked at the Northeast for catamount recovery, including the science around habitat suitability, public attitudes towards restoration, catamount restoration, and then get a bit into some of the historical information on catamounts and their history in the northeastern landscape. We'll dive into 3 real-world kind of catamount stories that I hope kind of illuminate and help us explore kind of the past of catamounts of this region, the present-day reality of what it would take to see them restored, and the potential future of catamounts in the Northeast. So I'm hoping that these stories kind of illuminate some of the historical forces that led to their disappearance of the species from the landscape, and the current day kind of ecological and landscape barriers that remain for their recovery, and then dive into some kind of examples of successful coexistence with mountain lions in other parts of the country. So I'll just introduce myself briefly here. So I grew up in the Hudson Valley region in New York. I didn't find actually the Adirondacks until much later in life. I wish my family had vacationed in the Adirondacks when I was a child, but we did spend quite a bit of time up in Green Mountain National Forest, up in Vermont, which is actually where I learned, where to ski, horseback ride, spend a lot of times outdoors. I always say that the photograph in the top right-hand corner was arguably the most important day of my life, which is the first day that I rode a horse at the Vermont State Fair in Rutland, Vermont. From there, became a full-blown horse fanatic. If you have one of those in your family, you likely know how deep the passion for horses runs. But horses were kind of a conduit for my love for wild nature and the wildlife and animals. I ended up moving out west for about a decade, where I studied wildlife ecology. I got the opportunity to study that in Greater Yellowstone River ecosystem, where I went to school, which was a really kind of foundational experience. I did some wildlife research on birds of prey when I was out in Montana. And I also got the opportunity to study in Yellowstone National Park. The photograph in the middle is actually me in an inactive wolf den. And that was a pre-approved activity by a park ranger who was with us that day. But it was an unbelievable place to study ecology, in that I got to witness firsthand predator-prey dynamics and kind of the ecology of an ecosystem that has its full suite of species, from the very bottom of an ecosystem all the way to the top, large carnivores such as grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions, and got to study firsthand kind of the predator-prey dynamics that play out in those ecosystems. After a good amount of time out west, I came back and I attempted the photograph in the bottom corner is actually me attempting a through hike of the Appalachian Trail. Highlight the word attempted because I didn't fully execute that, but I did get an opportunity to hike the most beautiful section of the Appalachian Trail from Maine down to Massachusetts before I called my mom and asked her to pick me up because that was enough miles to hike. And I always say that that hike did that back in 2015, and that was a really kind of important hike for me on a personal level because I think it made me re-fall in love with this ecosystem that I had, really grown kind of an imprint on me at a really young age, and the kind of northeastern woods, which I deeply love. And it also opened up some question over why it is that this region is still lacking some of its top carnivore species and what impacts that continues to have to the ecology of this region. So with that, I'll get into kind of the topic of today's discussion. So I'll start with kind of a primer on rewilding, which might be a topic that many of you have heard about before, so it might be a bit of a refresher, but I'll just briefly kind of introduce the conservation topic of rewilding to all of you. So this is a quote by a mentor and colleague of mine, also a great Adirondack rewilder, John Davis, who has said that rewilding, in essence, is giving the land back to wildlife and wildlife back to the land. I commonly give kind of the shorthand definition of rewilding as the restoration and recovery of wildness. It's a conservation strategy that thinks about large continental scale and restoration and protection of ecosystems. When I define rewilding for folks, I commonly use kind of the 3Cs definition, which is a common way to describe this conservation strategy of protecting the 3Cs, which is cores, corridors, and then that third C being carnivores. So protecting core habitat patches, which are large core wilderness areas protected from human intervention, providing safe spaces where ecosystems can regenerate and support a diversity of wildlife, including some of our larger mammals. This goes by many different names: wilderness, wildlands, ecological reserves, or in the Adirondack Park, forever wild conservation. Adirondack Park is a perfect example of a core habitat patch where wildlife is able to find refuge, and the ebb and flow of life is able to, exist pretty unimpeded from human intervention. And then thinking about protection of corridors, where wildlife movement or linkages connect these core areas, allowing animals to move freely and maintain things like genetic flow and ensure populations aren't living in isolation from one another. Relatedly, sometimes we throw in a fourth C, which is connectivity, which is the degree to which a landscape is able to facilitate or impede wildlife movement. So these corridors are crucial for connectivity for wildlife populations between core habitats. I commonly kind of bucket those two cores and corridors into what I call passive rewilding, which is protecting and letting nature kind of direct the ebb and flow of life. But on the flip side of that, there's also more active rewilding, which is thinking about species restoration and restoring some of the missing puzzle pieces of our ecosystems, which includes carnivore species. So, and then, just included this beautiful map that Wildlands Network has made, which is kind of the vision for an Eastern Wildway, which is an interconnected from Florida all the way up to Maine ecosystem, looking at a continental scale, kind of core habitats and corridors for wildlife to be able to move freely throughout this landscape. So tonight we'll be talking about catamounts. This is actually a species that holds the record for the most common names out of any species in the world. They have well over 250 names found across the Americas. And that's in part because this species in particular actually has one of the widest ranges or distribution of any species, which stretches from kind of the southernmost tip of Alaska all the way down through the very tip of South America. So throughout that range, they've actually developed a variety of common names. Here in the Northeast, you'll hear them most commonly be called Catamount, which actually means cat of the mountain, which I think is well suited to our landscape. But they also are called a variety of other names, including cougar, mountain lion, panther, puma, and some more unique ones such as wildcat, ghost cat, painter. I've more recently learned of some of the traditional indigenous names as well. So the Abenaki name for catamount is Bitolo. So throughout the range, the use of names is very different, but they're all the same species, which scientific name is Puma concolor. So I just want to start by introducing the species. I'll play some footage in the background while I do this, and just provide kind of a few facts just to get acquainted with who mountain lions are and who catamounts are. So these are actually two kittens from a den in mountain lion range in the Santa Monica Mountains in Southern California. Mountain lion researchers in really the last decade have learned a ton more about the species because of trail cam footage like this. So this is two kittens, and some things you'll notice about these guys. So kittens are actually born with spots that fade with age. So when they're full grown, those spots will have faded away and they'll grow into one consistent color. These are kind of subadult mountain lions, 3 mountain lion subadults in this footage was provided to us from the Utah Mountain Lion Conservation Group. So these are 3 subadults from a mountain range out in Utah. And an important thing to know about mountain lions is that mothers will typically have about 2 to 4 kittens per litter. They only reproduce roughly every 2 to 3 years. And this is in part because kittens actually spend the first 2 years of their life with their mothers. They depend on their mothers those first 2 years. Females actually spend 80% of their lives in the presence of kittens. And this is because mountain lion mothers actually teach kittens really important hunting behaviors, how to stay away from danger and how to interact in the wild. I love this photograph. This is a mountain lion in Bandelier National Monument who caught on to the fact that he was being spied on. So he's got a trail camera in his mouth. But one thing to know about mountain lions that researchers will commonly talk about is that very, very curious species, but very much ruled by caution, which is part of the reason that they're very rarely seen in the wild, very elusive species that most people, millions of folks recreate in mountain lion habitat every day, and almost very few of them ever encounter or see mountain lions. So I'm just going to play some footage, no sound, just kind of in the background, from a great documentary that's actually free and on YouTube. It's called The Secret Lives of Mountain Lions. I encourage folks to go and explore this to learn a bit more about the species. But essentially the film followed a mountain lion family that a mother raising 2 kittens in the Wind River Range in Wyoming. And again, the amazing thing about footage like this is, trail cameras have given us kind of this firsthand look into the lives of these animals in a way that we never had before. So she actually had 4 kittens at the beginning. It gets whittled down. Only 2 survive in the end, not to give you a spoiler. But a few things, that we've discovered from trail cam footage like this is that mountain lions are actually far more social than we originally believed them to be. They're actually far more domestic cat-like as well. One of the really interesting things as I watch footage of mountain lions and learn more about them every day is some of the behaviors that you'll see displayed by mountain lions actually remind me quite a bit of domestic cats. So if you have domestic cats at home, you'll see many behaviors and movements that might remind you of cats at home, such as this, like the playful behavior that mountain lions will display with one another and in the wild. They live in communities and actually interact with neighboring mountain lions, which researchers didn't know until the last several decades. These communities are actually governed by adult males who kind of define the boundary and territories. And sometimes they'll actually share food as kind of a social currency in those family units, which is also displayed on some footage in this documentary as well. And then throughout their range, this is the clip I was talking about. This is actually mother and the kitten as one of subadult male kind of comes in and starts to feed on a carcass that she had taken down. So there's actually quite a bit of food sharing that goes on as well. So throughout Mountain Lion Range, they actually, like we talked about, they range all the way from kind of southern tip of Alaska all the way down to South America. And throughout that range, they hunt. The most common animal prey source that they hunt is whatever hooved animal, large hooved animal lives within that range. So in the Western United States, this is typically your typical deer species, sometimes occasionally elk as well in certain ranges. And then down all the way to South America, the most common species is a species known as a guanaco, which is kind of an alpaca animal. So I'll just briefly touch on some of the ecological benefits of catamounts. So they're highly interactive species supporting biodiversity and ecosystem resiliency. They're known in the ecological world as a keystone species. More recently, and I really love this term, mountain lion researchers kind of coined the term ecological brokers. And I think it just provides a great visual for their kind of highly interactive nature, which is that they broker relationships in nature. So this was actually this graphics from a seminal paper that looked at all of the ecological interactions that catamounts have with other species where they range, and it documented well over 543 to be exact, different ecological interactions between catamounts and 485 unique species throughout their range. The most, typically kind of thought about interactions are those with kind of their primary source of prey. So those kind of predator prey effects. So they do have a direct effect on their source of prey here in the Northeast, most likely would be white-tailed deer. So they're influential in sustaining balanced prey populations. And related to that, they also have an effect on helping slow the spread of wildlife diseases. So in some ranges in the Western United States, they've actually found that catamounts will prey on deer with commonly infected with chronic wasting disease. So they actually have a direct impact on slowing the spread of wildlife diseases by preying on those deer with chronic wasting disease in ungulate herds. But they also have an effect on behavioral effect on other species, including their prey, but also including mesocarnivores. So there's interactions between catamounts and competitors, such as coyotes and foxes, and they affect the way that those animals behave in the landscape. And then another kind of category of effects is what's known as carry-on effects. And carry-on is actually essentially the carcasses that are left behind by catamounts on the landscape. So this graphic kind of displays all of the various species that are impacted by carcasses on the landscape, which benefits everything from plant diversity and beetle assemblages, all the way up to bears and food that they need when they're emerging or entering hibernation. Foxes depend on mountain lion prey during cold winter months. Small mammals have greater access to food because of these carcasses on the landscape. Raptors and birds of prey rely on carcasses as well. So they're a real source of life in ecosystems. A great example of this, because I've spent quite a bit of time in Yellowstone National Park, there's a reason that photographers, when a carcass gets taken down in a highly visible part of the park, will flood to that location and set their spotting scopes on carcasses in the landscape, because they know that carcasses bring in birds of prey, other carnivore species, wolves, grizzly bears. So it's just a source of food and kind of massive interaction in the landscape. So I will switch into kind of the second part of the presentation, which is walking through three real life catamount stories as we kind of explore the potential restoration of catamounts in the Northeast. And I still find that kind of the oldest form of communication is still the most effective and compelling one, and that's storytelling. So I particularly love this quote from one of my favorite books, The Overstory by Richard Powers, which says, "The best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story." So on that note, I'll jump into a few Catamount stories and share those with you all. So I've broken up these stories into kind of three chapters. The first one I call The Vanishing, which is the story of the last confirmed catamount killed in Vermont in 1881. The second chapter I call The Long Trek, which is the story of a more modern day mountain lion who made a pretty remarkable trek over 1,500 miles to the East Coast. And then the last chapter I call The Wild Neighbor, which is kind of a modern day mountain lion hero who took up shop in Los Angeles, California. So I'll start with this first story, which we call the Vanishing. So this is the last confirmed mountain lion killed in the Northeast back in 1881. This story is fairly well documented by the Vermont Historical Museum. So as the story goes, it was actually Thanksgiving Day in 1881. There was a 15-year-old boy by the name of James Caldwell. He was out in the woods outside Barnard, Vermont, and he actually came upon some fresh tracks in the freshly fallen snow. He thought they looked particularly large and unusual, so he actually ran into town. He gathered up a few individuals. He brought them out. They found the tracks. They actually tracked this animal through the woods before eventually coming upon it. And this gentleman in this photograph is a gentleman by the name of Alexander Caldwell, who was the gentleman who actually shot the catamount twice, eventually killing it. So they likely didn't know that this would be the last documented catamount killed in the state of Vermont and throughout the Northeast. But this was an interesting time in kind of the history of this landscape. It was a time of massive habitat destruction and loss. Our forests in the Northeast were being heavily deforested. Paving way for farmland and kind of agricultural transition that was happening with colonization. Also, wildlife populations were taking a huge plummet. It wasn't just catamounts, but some of our more common species today, such as turkey, white-tailed deer. These were disappearing from the landscape. And then catamounts, like many carnivores, were actually targeted for extermination. Some of the first laws that were adopted in many of the Northeast states were actually known as bounty laws, where people would receive payments for killing carnivores such as wolves and catamounts. This particular animal was actually taxidermied and then brought across the state as kind of a traveling curiosity. So this is actually a poster that was used across the state to draw people in to actually observe this animal. People would pay to actually see this animal in person. But as I mentioned, it wasn't just the catamount that was seeing a massive population decline and functional extinction from the landscape at that time. The 1800s, we saw a range of species have range contractions, massive population declines, and were either regionally extirpated or in some cases went extinct altogether, thinking about passenger pigeon or eastern elk. Just to touch on a few of these, some of the most common iconic species today, like wild turkey, once common throughout the Northeast, saw really widespread decline due to overhunting and widespread clearing of forests, which left them essentially no habitat or refuge. So turkeys were extirpated from New York and most northeastern states by the mid-1800s. They were reintroduced into New York in the 1950s. They actually sourced populations from Pennsylvania, brought them over, translocated, and reintroduced turkey back into New York. They did the same in Vermont in the 1960s and 70s, actually sourced them from New York, brought them over to Vermont, reintroduced turkeys back into Vermont. Similar story for white-tailed deer, nearly wiped out in New York and New England by the late 1800s. restored through reintroductions as well as closed hunting seasons. In New York, hunting season for deer was closed for nearly 2 decades, from roughly 1865 to 1887. And this was when reintroductions kind of started to take hold and the species started to see population recovery. Today, white-tailed deer, turkey, these are two very abundant populations across the Northeast. In many regions, there's actually overabundance of white-tailed deer populations. So in many standards, this could be seen as kind of one of the state's and the region's kind of greatest wildlife success stories. It's also proof that restoration and species recovery can happen and can be successful. Similar stories for some of these other species, but I won't get into each of these just to save on time. I guess putting a bow on that quickly. So, part of the reason I mention some of these species and the recovery that we've had and kind of the helping hand that we've needed to provide species in order to be restored in the Northeast is that really kind of our more modern day conservation legacy post-colonization in this region has really been one of restoration and recovery. Over the last 100 years, we've been working to really recover and heal this landscape and the communities as well that saw real destruction and depletion from the turn of the last century. And catamounts were a species that went extinct in this region throughout that time and still haven't been able to recover populations since 1881. This cat, so this is actually the cat that was killed in 1881, who's now on display at the Vermont Historical Museum in Montpelier. And so they have a great exhibit if folks are interested and ever in that neck of the woods where you can actually see the animal. And it also kind of covers a bit of the cultural history of the species as well, which is really interesting. So, we saw this shift that happened within Vermont, but also kind of wider New England, which was catamounts were at the turn of the last century, particularly vilified. There was bounty payments out, active predator extermination campaigns. And then around kind of the 1920s, and this is documented in the exhibit fairly well, there was kind of this cultural shift that happened with the species where they all of a sudden became a species that was kind of viewed more as like a cherished icon and a kind of, unofficial mascot of the state of Vermont in particular. So many of these are kind of cultural examples of how the species is used across the state. Most notably, in 1926 was adopted as the mascot of the State University of Vermont. But there's a whole variety of ways in which they pop up culturally on our license plates, IPAs named after them. My personal favorite is the Catamount Cornhole Club, which is a cornhole club in Rutland, which I still have not checked out, but it's on my list. So the second story I want to chat about is what I call the long trek. And I think one of the biggest questions that I get as I talk about the potential restoration of catamounts in the Northeast is whether or not they can make it back on their own. And I always say with wildlife to never say never, because I've learned that wildlife are exceptionally adaptable and resilient. But what the last several decades have shown us is how difficult of a journey it is for mountain lions to make it from their current breeding populations in the Western United States all the way to the Northeast. That being said, there was a particularly epic cat that whose story is actually fairly well documented in a book that I highly recommend called Heart of a Lion by William Stolzenberg. I'm actually trying to get Will to potentially come out here for a presentation in the Northeast, maybe later this year. But over the last many decades, there's only been one individual that's actually been documented making it across the entire country. And his journey was fairly well documented as he was moving across the US. So he actually his birthplace and departure point was in the Black Hills of South Dakota. It's estimated that he probably dispersed from that location around September in 2009. And he, instead of, setting his sights eastward, setting his sights westward, he actually set his sights eastward, and started dispersing in an eastward direction. He was caught on several trail cameras and documented sightings in Minnesota, throughout Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula. He was also kind of went off grid a little bit during his time, probably in Ontario, before he eventually came down, was documented in New York State, before eventually, unfortunately, being struck and killed by a vehicle on I-90 outside Milford, Connecticut. So this journey, again, was fairly well documented as he moved across the country. And a few, I guess, key takeaways from this journey is that this was a cat that was likely in search of a female to breed with. What we know about mountain lion dispersal is that they have what's called male bias dispersal. And so males actually travel longer distances than females. We very rarely see females make long distance dispersals, such as this one. Females will many times actually occupy just neighboring territories from their mother, or not very far away from kind of their natal territory. But males will set off on these long distances, likely to avoid genetic inbreeding, and trying to find females not related to them in order to breed with. This cat, made such an epic journey. He was able to cross hundreds of roadways. He made it through kind of a gauntlet of roads in the Midwest, as well as through multiple human communities, but unfortunately was never able to find a female to breed with, which was likely, his sole source of dispersal. So touching on kind of current and historical range of mountain lions. So to date, the closest breeding population of mountain lions to the northeastern United States would be in the Black Hills of South Dakota. There's also a small isolated population of what's called Florida panthers, same species, but they call them panthers in Florida, living in and around Everglades National Park as well. But they're heavily restricted due to kind of the gauntlet of roads that exist to the north of that region. But east of the Mississippi, there's no documented breeding populations of catamounts. There have been dispersals that have happened into the Midwest, into the Great Lakes region. Again, these have almost always been male mountain lions who are likely in search of females to find their own breeding populations and territories. But unfortunately, natural recolonization is heavily restricted by female dispersal, which has been, up until this point, fairly limited based on kind of the ecology of the species. I get the question of, well, can they come back on their own? Can't they come to the Northeast and recolonize on their own? And what we know from recent kind of modeling data that's actually compiled everything we know about catamount dispersal and all the cats that have tried over the last several decades, it shows us that really at best what we can hope for is for mountain lions to reoccupy about 2.1% of their historical range by 2100. And we expect that to be mostly in boreal Canada, which is essentially this red arrow is showing expected recolonization by 2100. There is a chance of mountain lions, starting to expand their range into the Great Lakes. There was an exciting story out of Michigan where there was a breeding pair of mountain lions, but it's only one breeding pair that has been confirmed as of recently in the last several decades. And so they're heavily restricted to the Western United States at the current moment. But one of the related questions that we get as we talk about the potential for natural recolonization in the Northeast is, if they could make it back on their own, is there suitable habitat in the East? Is there suitable habitat in the Northeast for them to actually sustain breeding populations and recover in this region? And the short answer is yes. a recent study that was done. I'll cover this quickly. Happy to share more information with folks that are kind of data minded and want to dive into this a little bit more. But a recent study found that there were 17 habitat patches of large contiguous blocks of over 6,000 square kilometers or less east of the Mississippi. 13 of those were actually greater than 10,000 square kilometers. And that size is actually believed to be among cougar researchers as the minimum size needed to maintain healthy, isolated populations of mountain lions that aren't connected to other metapopulations. That being said, looking at these habitat patches in the Northeast and potential wildlife corridors that exist between these core habitat patches, it's likely that mountain lions would be able to move through this landscape not in isolation from one another, but actually connected. Obviously, the Adirondack Park is a prime habitat for potential mountain lion recovery. The last mountain lion story that I want to touch on is what I call the wild neighbor. And this is actually a story of a fairly famous mountain lion that actually goes by the name of P22, which is the alphanumerical name that was given to him by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. He he actually passed away a few years ago now. He was a fairly epic, well-known mountain lion that actually took up shop in Griffith Park, which, if you're familiar with Los Angeles, California, is famously the park that houses the Hollywood sign. This photograph is a photograph that made him fairly famous, in which he was photographed right under that Hollywood sign. And he, I think, became, very emblematic of what was possible and how human communities could coexist with large carnivores like this yet again. And, you know, Los Angeles County is obviously one of the most densely populated human communities in the United States. And so I always like to say if Los Angeles can do it, I think anyone can do it, especially here in the Northeast. And the cool thing about P22 is the Los Angeles community really rallied behind him. If you go across the city of Los Angeles, there's multiple murals of him. They call him the King of the Hills. They have a P22 festival that happened on a yearly basis. So he was a real emblem of coexistence and how communities could effectively coexist with large carnivore neighbors yet again. Touching on coexistence real quickly. So, coexistence is essentially kind of the key to a successful restoration like this. The good news is that we have proven non-lethal husbandry or coexistence practices that can protect against conflicts with cougars. This is another question and comment that I commonly get as I've been going across the state and the region talking to communities about the potential for catamount restoration. We talk about kind of the technical support and technical solutions to preventing conflicts with carnivores, with catamounts specifically. But coexistence is also more about tolerance and the willingness of people to live alongside the species, and that requires a certain kind of shifting of hearts and minds. And part of our goal and the goal with thinking about restoration in the Northeast is to help provide the technical support that would be needed to adapt to our landscape to the restoration of this large carnivore species. But we also want to increase kind of public tolerance for living alongside large carnivores yet again. And really, I would say foster kind of pride in potentially having these magnificent animals back in our landscape after 150-year absence and getting to take part in kind of the conservation legacy of their potential, their return. On that note, another kind of question and topic is, well, is there public support for Catamounts return in the Northeast? And the kind of preliminary answer on that is yes. Initial polling and survey data has shown that there is strong support for the return and restoration of catamounts in the Northeast. There was a survey of residents in 7 eastern states, and specifically, cumulatively, the ratio of strong support to strong opposition for catamount restoration was at a 10-to-1 ratio. Essentially, that means for every one person opposing catamount restoration, there were 10 that were supportive of their return. And that public support actually grew stronger the further up into the Northeast you traveled. So I'll end and then on two notes, and then we can open it up to question and answer. But I'll end on kind of the how and the why behind this initiative, because there are two kind of common questions that I get, which is, okay, how do we do this? Sounds great, but like, what is the first step of this kind of process? And then also, we'll kind of get well, what's kind of the reason, the why behind why we should do this? And so I'll start with the how. How do we bring catamounts home? How do we initiate this process? And our current ask and hope is, initiating a genuine kind of inquiry into the benefits and the process of restoring this native missing species. And the first step of that process would be what's known as a feasibility study, ideally an agency-led feasibility study to look at the potential for restoration, which would include all of the open questions on kind of the social, ecological, biological processes and questions that would need to be considered in the context of a restoration, which would also hopefully include a robust stakeholder engagement process. So communities across the Northeast, from outdoor recreationalists and hunters and farming and working lands communities, all of those communities could partake in some sort of stakeholder engagement process on catamount restoration specifically. And then just to kind of finish on the why behind this, I think at its core, it's similar to the why behind every other species restoration that we've partaken in and has happened in the last century, which is beginning to repair a loss that's really echoed through this landscape for generations. That last cat was killed in 1881, and outside of the documented cat that made that trek across the country and was killed in Connecticut, there hasn't been catamounts back in this landscape since 1881. And so this initiative is really working to repair that loss that we've felt in so many ecological and cultural ways throughout this landscape for generations. Relatedly, this catamounts would restore healthy ecosystems. We know that catamounts are a keystone predator. They're vital to balanced and resilient forests. And so we know that their restoration would have a benefit on our ecosystems here in the Northeast. And then touching on, the other element of this, which is that what we know at the current moment is that they won't make it back on their own without a helping hand. And so our kind of active participation in catamount restoration in the Northeast is imperative to restore them to this region. And then how I sum up this initiative in kind of 3 words is that at the heart of this, I know that they belong here. Catamounts belong in our forests. They were here for many generations before us, and they deserve to be back walking in our forests, including the Adirondacks once again. So on that note, I'll wrap up so we have time for Q&A. I hope I left enough time. I'll encourage folks to visit bringcatamounts.home.org, which is kind of a source of learning more about this project and this initiative. I've also put my contact email, and then the QR code is for folks who might be interested in signing up for our email list.
Thank you, Renee. I'm going to start with something that I was really curious about. Can you address any potential interactions between people and catamounts, in an area like the Adirondacks that's where so many people are outside recreating, often off-trail bushwhacking? What does that look like? How do mountain lions come into conflict with people in the areas where they live?
Yeah, definitely. Great question, and super important for in thinking about their restoration into the Northeast because of how big our recreational economy is in the Adirondacks and throughout the Northeast. So yeah, what I'll say is, catamounts, millions of people live within kind of mountain lion and catamount range in the Western United States. The risk to people is very low. People recreate in cougar country every day. Serious or dangerous encounters remain extremely rare. But there is, some important steps that people can take to protect themselves when in cougar country, just being kind of more aware of your surroundings. And with basic education and really kind of proving coexistence tools, we know that, coexistence is possible with cougars as it is in the West, out here in the East.
Thank you. I have another interesting one here from a participant who writes that catamount sightings have become fairly common in the Northeast. Some are erroneous, some are travelers, others are exotic pets set loose. And if there is, or when there is a breeding population in the Northeast, how will biologists know that it's a breeding population?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, I don't know if I actually might have skipped over this in my talk, but what does occasionally happen, because I know that there are dozens of sightings that are reported to wildlife agencies in the Northeast every year, and almost all of those turn out to be not catamounts, kind of misidentification of other species. Um, every once in a while, there has been documentation that those sightings have actually turned out to be exotic pets, as the person who asked the question mentioned. But breeding populations typically, it is easy, not easy, but researchers are able to document those populations with trail cam footage and sign of catamount denning behaviors and kittens when that breeding happens. So typically, researchers that study mountain lions in the West are able to identify that fairly easily in the wild.
Great, thank you. Yeah, an interesting question. Can you discuss how Mighty Earth or other organizations might be funding some of the feasibility studies that you talked about, or community meetings and reintroductions? Where would the funding from that come from? So that, will the states be asked to contribute, or is this, where's the money coming from for this?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. Yeah, so we're working, trying to get a commitment for a feasibility study to move forward. And at the current moment, there's been no ask for state level funding to support this research process. There's interest from private foundations and other funders to actually help support doing this first step of a feasibility study. So there would be direct financial assistance to undertake kind of this initiation and process, which is super important because our agencies are obviously really strapped for capacity and funding at the moment. And this kind of initial process would ideally be privately funded to not pull on that agency capacity and funding.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Um, this one's kind of a little specific, but I'm curious too. Have there been any instances of catamounts going after bison as prey? And just again, because we're in the Northeast, I'm curious about moose too.
Yeah. So I have never heard of a catamount taking down a bison. I think likely far too large of a prey species for them to take down, and just like far too risky. So I haven't heard documentation of that. Again, I would not say that it's never happened. There might be an instance, but it's not a primary source of prey that I've read about in any studies. I similar for moose, although I have heard of occasional catamounts or mountain lions taking calves, but typically not moose. I haven't heard, like full-grown adult moose. I haven't heard of that as a common source of prey. That being said, every habitat and kind of prey base is different. So, different circumstances might lead to catamounts preying on different animals, but I haven't heard of it being a common source of prey in the Western United States.
Okay, thank you. I have a question and then a second to this question. How might we convince state wildlife agencies to at least support cougar restoration, at least the feasibility studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think um, you know, one of the things I touched on is really this like conservation legacy that we have over the last years of kind of restoration. And so we've done this with a variety of other species. And so I think this is ideally kind of the next step of that conservation legacy would be thinking about restoring catamounts. And I think, asking our agencies to prioritize this as a conservation strategy, I think is something that anybody can participate in doing, communicating to your wildlife agency or your state legislators about your interest in seeing this happen. And we're hoping at Mighty Earth and bringcatamountshome.org to provide ways and kind of action advocacy ways that people can actually directly advocate and ask for this to be something that our wildlife agencies prioritize in the future.
Yeah. Uh, a participant asked that the website, the Bring Catamounts Home website seems to be fairly focused on Vermont right now.
Yeah.
So how is the campaign engaging stakeholders regionally? And
Mhm.
will the campaign expand to have staff based in other New England states?
Yeah, we would love to expand. We want this to be regionally collaborative process. I will say, right now, based in New York and based in Vermont, and like undertaking this initiative on a state level in Vermont, kind of focusing our efforts. But we're hoping to expand those efforts throughout the Northeast because it's our hope that catamounts wouldn't be restricted to, obviously they don't see state lines and boundaries, and a place like Adirondack Park would be a perfect habitat, like we talked about in those habitat suitability studies. So we want this to be a regional effort, and I think we have hopes to do more advocacy in neighboring states. This is a great kind of introduction for the Adirondack Land Trust supporters in New York. So I'm hopeful that we can do a bit more public education and outreach work, not just defined in Vermont, but also in neighboring states. And ideally, we'd see in the context of a feasibility study, a regionally collaborative process where states are kind of working together to talk about the restoration of this species and the management and kind of frameworks that would be required, not just at a state level, but by every state in the Northeast to actually manage the species successfully.
Okay, great. You are ripping through these fast. I've got
Sorry.
one more. No, it's great. One more and
Okay.
maybe two before we wrap up. One I think is going to be quite short. But we have another question with a second, and that is from a questioner who asks that a reintroduction of lynxes failed in the Adirondacks. Why might mountain
Mm.
lions fare any better than lynxes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's there's quite a few kind of comparisons that and differences that you could make between a species like lynx and a species like catamounts. Lynx are highly like obligate carnivore that relies directly on snowshoe hare populations in order to be successful. And so they're not able to hunt other sources of prey. They directly hunt snowshoe hare and rely on that prey base. Catamounts are a do rely primarily on deer populations. They are a bit more flexible, but I think there's a lot of circumstances in terms of like how specific links are to how they kind of co-evolved with snowshoe hare populations and reliant on those in order for survival um, that we don't see with catamounts.
I really want to thank you, Renee, just as a complete newcomer to the world of catamounts myself. It was fantastic, really interesting, just a wonderful hour. Great night.